Hey good people, welcome back. In this video we're going to learn more about type 1 and type 2 errors when hypothesis testing. Just as a reminder what they are, type 1 error is when you reject a true null hypothesis. A type 2 error is when you fail to reject a false null hypothesis. And a definition that I think states this a little bit more clear is right here. Type 2 errors occur when we reject a null hypothesis that is actually true. Type 2 errors occur when we accept a null hypothesis that is actually false. We're going to see a really tangible example of each of these type of errors in this video. So there's actually 4 things that can happen when you do a hypothesis test, and it's illustrated in this picture here. If the null hypothesis is true and you reject it, that's a type 1 error. That's one thing that can happen. If a null hypothesis is true and we don't reject it, that's another thing that can happen. Suppose the null hypothesis is false and we reject it. That's something that can happen. And finally, the null hypothesis is false and we fail to reject it. That's another thing that can happen. So these are the 4 possibilities that can occur. Notice that number 1 is a type 1 error, and that's when the null hypothesis is true and we incorrectly reject it. And this box down here is a type 2 error. That's when the null hypothesis is false and we incorrectly fail to reject it. It's hard to kind of wrap your head around these unless you see a real life problem. So let's consider a situation where an athlete goes in for a drug test for performance enhancing drugs. Suppose an athlete is being tested for using HGH, human growth hormone, as a performance enhancing drug. The normal amount of HGH level for adult males is typically 0.1 to 10 nanograms per milliliter of blood. So our null hypothesis is that this person has HGH levels within the normal range. And the alternative hypothesis is that their HGH levels are above the normal range. So our null hypothesis is that they're not using the performance enhancing drug. And the alternative hypothesis is that they are using the performance enhancing drug. Well, there's 4 things that could happen in this hypothesis test. 4 different things. Let's see what they are. So either they are not using the performance enhancing drug or they are. So let's first consider the case that they're not using HGH. If they're not using HGH, something can happen. They could test them for it and correctly determine that they're not using HGH. Or the athlete's not using HGH and they incorrectly determine that they are using it. Another thing that can happen is if the athlete is using HGH and the test correctly determines that the athlete is using HGH. Or perhaps they are using HGH and the test fails to catch it. The test incorrectly determines that the athlete is not using HGH. So these are 4 different possibilities. Which one of these possibilities is a type 1 error? Which one is a type 2 error? Well, it might help if we write out our null hypothesis again. The null hypothesis is that the athlete is not using HGH, and the alternative hypothesis was that the athlete is using HGH. A type 1 error is when you incorrectly reject the null hypothesis. So a type 1 error is when you incorrectly determine that they are using HGH, when in fact they're not using it. Which one indicates that? Which one shows that the person is using HGH when in reality they're not really using it? That would be this one down here. The test incorrectly determines that the athlete is using HGH. This is sometimes called a false positive because this athlete was incorrectly flagged as using the performance enhancing drug HGH when in actuality they were not using it. That's why a type 1 error is sometimes called a false positive. All right, which one of these over here is a type 2 error? Remember, a type 2 error is failing to reject a false null hypothesis. So failing to reject the false null hypothesis means that the null hypothesis is false, meaning that they actually are using HGH, and our test fails to determine that. It would be this one. The test incorrectly determines that the athlete is not using HGH when they actually are using HGH. This is sometimes called a false negative, this type 2 error. All right, hopefully this video gave you another good example of what type 1 and type 2 errors are. There are some ways you can learn more about this. I highly recommend reading chapter 20 in its entirety. I uploaded it along with this video and assignment in the Google Classroom post. Also, I uploaded a more abridged version of that chapter, which is the chapter 20 PowerPoint slides that came along with the publisher software. And finally, doing the assignment will really help you get a handle on what these errors mean. And I made this assignment a little different than what we've done in the past. This is really just a vocabulary assignment. It's about reading the chapter and understanding how to use the vocabulary. So the assignment begins by having you define 3 vocabulary words, and then there's a bunch of multiple choice questions that follow that. All right, thank you for watching the video, and I look forward to seeing you in our next video meeting.